Hello and welcome to a More Perfect podcast. Today, I'm honored to welcome on the show Clem, a former Chief Patrol Agent of the U.S. Border Patrol in Yuma, Arizona. Chris served for 27 and a half years on the Border Patrol and has witnessed the border crisis from the front lines of not only Yuma, Arizona, but El Paso, Texas as well. So Chris, welcome to the show.
Good morning, then good afternoon, or whatever time we're airing this. But yes, thank you for having me on the show. Always a pleasure to be able to speak about the Border Patrol and border security and having a platform to get the facts out there to the people.
Absolutely, sir. So let's get right into it. I like to tell stories on this podcast, and because I believe that stories are the most effective medium, more than anything else, of conveying information and making people remember something. So if you could tell me one story that can illustrate the border crisis, what would it be? What are some specific incidents that you were involved in at the border that you'll never be able to forget?
Well, I can tell you that it is something that is evolutionary that I saw build up and change over my 27 and a half years as an agent. When I was chief in Yuma, which is a small southwest area of Arizona and southeastern California, that was my responsibility there. I got there in 2020, December of 2020. We had just finished the federal fiscal year of 2020, and we just had a little over 8,800 arrests that year in Yuma alone, just in one southwest border sector. In comes the new administration, the Biden-Harris administration, in January of 2021. We ended federal fiscal year in Yuma alone with over 114,000 arrests. And the very next fiscal year 22, we went over 310,000 arrests just in Yuma alone. So do the math. We go from 8,800 to 114,000 to 312,000. We still had 950 Border Patrol agents. We were averaging close to certain times of the year over 1,000 arrests a day. We were outnumbered, 50 to 1, 100 to 1 every day out there. It was incredible. And again, this is something that I'll never be able to live down or forget, that we were ground zero on the border crisis for those years. And again, when I said 950 border patrols, that included me. I was the chief. It was a luxury to go out there and go patrol and make arrests. I was running a sector, and I had a division and leadership teams. There's individual agents out there sometimes were outnumbered 100 to 1. And, again, that just tells the story of how grossly mismanaged and misdirected the guidance and the direction out of Washington, D.C. Under the first few years of this administration impacted a community of Yuma that only has about 100,000 people in it. Yet we were meeting and exceeding that capacity. So, and we can dive into that more through some questions, or I'll just tell you more anecdotal information. But that's just one sector on the southwest border that was dealing with that.
So go into some of that anecdotal information. Did you ever, with these swaths of people coming to the border, did you ever come face to face with the cartel? Did anybody ever threaten your life or anything like that?
Well, yeah. So I mean, that kind of, there's always been, especially when you were a high profile, position. A chief can be considered a high profile position. There's always going to be those type of threats. But here's what's changed and what really happened over the last few years. And I would say over the last 10 or 15 years at the border. When I started back in the mid-90s in 1995, the smuggler, the cartel plaza boss, would allow people to, through the form of payment, pass through an area, and the smuggler would literally cross the border with the groups of people. if it was a human smuggler. If it was a drug smuggler, he would usually, cross with them, and then they would send them to a pickup location where they would drop off the drugs. Or if it was people, there'd be a staged vehicle waiting, and the smuggler would literally load the people in the vehicle and drive them to the next location, whether that be a border town or a city, off the border, or drive them all the way to Detroit, Michigan. Now, and what has happened over the last few years, because of policies, catch and release, some of the directives out of Washington, the smuggler gets all the payment or makes all the payment arrangements before they even get to the U.S. border, marches the group to go through this gap in the fence and wait for Border Patrol. And then Border Patrol actually, because of the policies, we catch them, we process them, we end up releasing these migrants into the country, and then they end up in their final destination, and that completes the smuggling cycle. So what used to be 90% of the people we were catching involved a smuggler, and we would catch the smuggler and prosecute the smuggler. Now that is all happening, and these people are letting the U.S. government is actually completing the smuggling cycle for them. So it's very rare now. It's very rare that we actually find the vehicles, and it still happens where people are evading arrest and they've got a driver. But the majority of this mass humanity that you're seeing and reading about is by design, and the cartels have almost no risk and all profit because they're not crossing the border. It's just the migrants are. So, there's still the traditional operations going on, but they're difficult to find because sometimes we're overwhelmed with the mass of humanity that I've described. And again, we those numbers I described continued to go up. This last fiscal year 24 that just finished, was the third highest or third busiest of the 4 years under the Biden-Harris administration. So while numbers went down, it was still the third busiest.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard reports, and maybe you can validate these reports of migrants being given cell phones by or at the border so they can get around, or so they can contact whoever they want to contact. Is that true?
That's a great question. Most of the people that we encounter, that I saw, and that I even continue to see, because I live in Arizona and I go down the border quite frequently to validate questions from reporters and just to make sure I continue to talk about real-time information. These groups that are coming across, they're all well prepared. There's at least one or two members in every. You could tell, like, this is a family together. This is 2 or 3 guys that are traveling together. They've all got communications of some sort. The days of somebody completely destitute coming across and just barely making it across the border, you don't see that. They're all well dressed. They've got their cell phones, because here's what people need to understand is this isn't a Mexico or just a Central American problem. There are 195 recognized countries and governments in the world. That was the latest number I've received, and I think you can back that on the internet. In the last 4 years, there's been people from 177 different countries enter the U.S. illegally. That was a number that I saw during a congressional hearing. The majority of people are flying in from around the world to places like Cancun or Mexico City on a passport and visa, like a tourist visa, and then they're coming in and working their way up to the U.S. border and crossing illegally. In Yuma specifically, they would fly to Mexico City or Cancun, take another flight to Mexicali, Baja California, and then through whatever arrangements they had, they would take like a shuttle bus, different, either a 15-passenger van or sometimes like an airport-looking shuttle, drive 45 minutes to the border near Yuma, and then they would walk across and give themselves up. This is still going on. They'll fly to parts like they'll go to Tijuana and cross in the San Diego area. So
I've heard Tijuana is really dangerous.
Oh yeah. Well, that area is really overwhelmed. And where I'm going with this is because you mentioned the cell phone. So these people are flying from around the world, and they're coordinating all this on their phones. And there's still some that are traditionally coming up through South America, going through the Darien Gap and crossing through that dangerous area and working their way the old traditional way, but they're flying in from around the world. And, if you've flown even domestically recently, everything is done on an app. Everything is done on your phone. Very few people are not traveling with some kind of connectivity to the World Wide Web. So it's not the same traditional mom and pop smuggling organization that's bringing the agricultural workers here. These are people coming from around the world. And I can tell you one last thing to kind of drive that point home. In Yuma, at least the 2 years I was chief there before I retired, rarely did Mexico or Central America make my, daily top, 5 or 10 or weekly top 5 or 10 countries. I mean, it was ground zero for like a United Nations of people.
Wow.
We led the country in Russian, Chinese, Ukrainian, you name it. There was countries I'm like, I don't even recognize this name. We had people from all over the world coming in, and that just made it that much more challenging for our Border Patrol agents because we all knew how to speak Spanish. We'd have to use translation services if people didn't speak English or Spanish.
I can imagine, yeah. Wow, that's insane. That's insane. And so flying to, as you said, Mexico City and then Mexicali and then crossing the border again and giving themselves up, that was the most common method you would see illegal immigrants to cross the border.
That was exactly what was.
Yes.
Yeah, that was exactly what was happening in Yuma. And then like my neighbor in Tucson sector was almost like just the opposite. Like most of his people would be trying to flee. And, I had mainly give ups, and he had a lot of people that were running from him because it was a completely different terrain, different challenges. And this is something that I think is very important too for all your audience to understand is there's 20 Border Patrol sectors, 9 on the southwest border. And this statement I'm going to make is applicable to any Border Patrol sector. But if you've been to one sector, you've been to just one sector. Like everything is different, whether it's terrain, whether it's the threat, the community, the infrastructure, border accessibility. I mean, there are places in the state of Arizona, there are 2 Border Patrol sectors, Tucson and Yuma. And I had wide open desert. You could literally see for miles. We had mountain ranges separating every once in a while. But you go to Tucson and you don't have the clear line of sight that we have. You go to places like New Mexico, which is part of the El Paso sector. It's wide open, high desert. But then you get into El Paso where it's urban. The largest international city in the world is El Paso and Juarez. So you have millions of people crammed in that region. And so you can cross the border and disappear in a downtown apartment complex in a matter of seconds, where in parts of the desert you may walk for days. And then you get down into Texas, and it's a river border, which is winding. So what works as far as technology and cameras and walls in one sector may have zero impact in another sector. So it is very challenging. It's not a one-size-fit-all challenge. So that's why it's always important to listen to the leaders and the men and women on the ground.
That absolutely makes sense. It certainly doesn't make it any easier for you guys to have a one-size-fits-all solution. It's just not realistic, it sounds like. I want to get into what you just said about, people like giving themselves up. But in the other sector, you had more traditional people trying to evade and, catching people that were smuggling drugs and other illicit materials, even human trafficking. I want to focus on the cartel for a minute.
Yeah, sure.
First off, we've already talked about how technology has changed the immigration as far as cell phones, as far as remote communication. Really quickly, can you validate something that I've heard, that the cartel now, they kind of have their own intelligence apparatus in a way? I've heard reports even of the cartel having their own drones where they'll fly drones and they'll see agents and then they'll be able to coordinate their runners away from those roads. Like, is that a real thing?
Yeah, so a couple things that you mentioned. First of all, I want everybody to understand the cartel is a business, right? It doesn't matter if it's the Sinaloa, the New Generation, the Gulf, the Legacy Zetas. Doesn't matter. They're all business and commodity neutral. It's about power and money. Their hierarchy and their business model is set up just like any Fortune 500 business company, right? They've got people that are Ivy League educated, that have gone to some of the best schools, that are managing their entire system, the accounting, the engineering for their clandestine operations, right? And they've got an entire chain of command and hierarchy. You take off one, there's somebody there to replace, right? So think of it as any other major corporation that is profit making, which is basically like our capitalist society. It's in money making business. So all those things you mentioned are absolutely correct. I do want to make it also very clear is while we were getting the lion's share of our arrest in Yuma were give ups, that was by design by the cartel, because they could send 100, 200, up to 500 people over the course of an hour in 2 or 3 different locations within a mile or two in Yuma, which would require, I wouldn't say allow, but would require me to have to collapse resources, because maybe I only had 20 or 30 agents patrolling, to go manage a group of 500 on the ground, which meant coordinating transportation for the process, just patting them all down to make sure who they are, before we even transport them to process. That would take hours to move 500 people in 1 or 2 buses and a handful of vans, which would leave, I had 126 linear miles of border. And if we've collapsed our resources to 1 mile, what do you think's happening to the other 125 miles? They're runners. They're running what they want. That was all by design. Let's send in 100 here, 50 here, 200 here, and that will shrink the resources of the Border Patrol to leave next to nothing out there. So even if we saw something on the camera, it would be difficult for us to respond. So everything that was crossing did not cross without the express written consent or control of the cartel, because they were managing the higher value targets that were coming through. And so that was happening on the ground in Yuma, happening at every sector. Back to your technology question, absolutely, they would send drones up, and they would use that to scout the area. They would also use drones to move product, because even a drone, an off-the-shelf drone, usually has a payload capacity of a half pound to a pound. So we have caught that multiple occasions where we would catch drones.
You would have to shoot down drones at the border that were.
Well, we didn't shoot them down. We didn't shoot them down. We were actually. I was the first sector out to actually have an anti-drone system where we could, if we were within I won't give up too much tradecraft, but we could basically land the clandestine drone. And so we weren't shooting them out of the ground, but we could maintain control of the drone and land it. And we would see, we would find them. They were running back like methamphetamine back and forth from a rooftop in Mexico to a neighborhood across, literally just flying it a quarter mile over the border wall and dropping it down. And then the whole system would take about 2 minutes from the time they would launch from Mexico, get to the United States. So there was that going on. And then we do know that they use that for scouting purposes. Just fly a drone a couple 100 feet up in the air, and you can look left and right. I don't see any Border Patrol vehicles. I don't see any dust clouds saying anybody's driving out here. Send the group through. So we know that drone threat is there. I know we've got our counter drone measures. Like I said, I don't want to get too much into tradecraft, but we do know that we do have a good sense of what's happening. But that is, how small a drone is. I mean, that's a needle in the haystack.
Exactly.
That's so it's very difficult. So this is where when we talk about where Congress can act, they can just make sure they codify things and rules and laws to give law enforcement, not just Border Patrol, but all law enforcement, certain tools, work with the FAA to ensure that we have control of the skies, as well as the airline industry too, so we can make sure that we are stopping these threats at the ground level and the low level to protect American property and interest.
Absolutely, sir. Yeah.
Yeah.
that makes sense. I want to get into policy later, though.
Sure.
But that is a very, very freaking good point. They're using drones in Ukraine as well. There's drone warfare over there, and my God, is it terrifying.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about that, right? So we haven't talked about the terror nexus, and for years, especially after 9/11, we worried about dirty bombs and things like that. But we know that fentanyl, people ingest that kind of stuff. It can kill you. Everybody's going to react differently. So, you think about the threat of putting a half kilo of fentanyl on a drone and just flying that thing into a group of law enforcement on the side of the border, I mean, or, to Petco Park in San Diego, right? Not to alarm it. We've got the law enforcement that are monitoring those things, but this is where these threats are real. And technology and interconnectedness is a wonderful thing when it's being used for good. When it's being used for bad, we don't need to be panicked, but we need to be aware and we need to be prepared.
Yep. The best defense is offense.
Yep. Well, I mean, we will talk about policy later, but these are the type of things that we've got to make sure that we don't write policy out of our way that restricts law enforcement from actively doing their job. Protect the American people, give them their freedoms at the same time, but do not handcuff law enforcement from using technology to our advantage, because the bad guys don't play by the rules. So
you're damn right about that.
Yep.
You're really smart. I got to give it to you.
Well, I appreciate that. It's years of experience, right? A lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and well, I used to have a very high, tight, flat top that I maintained myself, and I used to say I didn't get this flat top from ducking, right? It was always because I ran into things. But you learn on the School of Hard Knocks. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. You're very welcome. It's very well deserved. So it sounds like the cartels exert control over the southern border with masses of people, with an intelligence apparatus of drones, with all of these things. Is there ever any do they ever try to cross the border and have their own agents on one side of the border that are kind of screwing with the border patrol or border operations in like a almost a pinching mechanism? Do they ever try to bribe off border patrol?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the technology side of things, because just like everything else, we've advanced, and so has all of the world, to include the cartels. But there's still the old school, way of doing business. I mean, I was just down in Nogales, which is about an hour drive south of where I live now, Nogales, Arizona, and
Sure.
I was out there, and I could see the scout up on the mountaintops. I mean, you still have the people that are paid to be up there, just to be observers, right? To keep the good guys' attention. Like, why is this guy up on the side of this hilltop, a mile away from anywhere, just looking north, right? He's there to be a distraction, to be a draw, to keep the attention of law enforcement. The camera's focused on him. He's probably just, relaying back, hey, there's vehicles driving here. There's, people walking here. There's that side that's still going on. You've got, you at the end of the day, we're still human beings that have free will. And if there is, corruption is alive and well in any facet of our world, and that is something that is very much a concern along the border. I've had to deal with my share of that with people in the workforce that were, not doing always the right things, and so that's why we have a very strict hiring practice now, and subject to polygraph, and we've got a very robust internal affairs, and no one hates a bad cop more than a good cop, and the same thing applies to border patrol or a state trooper or whatever.
Yeah.
One of the most honorable and humbling and gut-wrenching things I ever had to do was make a death notification, or give an American flag to a widow because somebody lost their life protecting our country and trying to secure our border. And then when you find out that there are people amongst your ranks that have, looked the other way, or may have, taken a bribe to, pass something through. I mean, those things occurred. Those are things that were very fresh and, on top of mind when you're a leader of any, whether I was running a station or running an entire sector, is like, why is this happening? Is somebody on the take? And so we would run our checks and balances and make sure. It's uncomfortable, but it's the right thing to do if you've got questions. And the public would report things, and we would follow through with that, because we took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that includes enemies foreign and domestic. And even if they're within our own ranks, I'm fortunate that a lot of my leads or information we would follow through, and there would be nothing more than a ticked off ex-girlfriend, something like that, or a neighbor that was mad, or an anti-cop person. But occasionally you'd find out, well, unfortunately this person is got some ties, and and would lead to their removal, right? So those things do occur, but the good news is it's few and far between, and we've got a very robust internal affairs apparatus to limit that. And the men and women that I saw in my organization, fortunately no one I knew in my inner circle was ever that way, but the young men and women that we were hiring, where they were squared away, and because they'd gone through a rigorous background. So I feel like our confidence level that kind of stuff is minimum. I feel very confident now that in the years past it was questionable, but now the confidence that I think I have in our backgrounds and people being above board is at its highest. And we could read a report tomorrow, and I'd be like, well, sorry. But my knowledge and my understanding, I feel much better today than I did 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that comes from a strong place of leadership, So one final question before we get into policy, and it's a pretty dark question. A few months ago, I saw a movie. It was called Sound of Freedom, and it was about human trafficking, specifically child sex slavery. How can you spot human trafficking? Did you ever have to deal with any, or did you ever hear any reports of children being trafficked? And this is a very broad spanning question, but how does human trafficking work at the southern border? Yeah.
So what you're describing is just really the horrors of the first layer of this humanitarian border crisis, because victims of trafficking don't know that they're victims of trafficking. And when you're not free to go, when you're not free to make the decisions, you are being trafficked in its broadest sense. Every unaccompanied minor, especially the tender age, the young ones, the 12 and under, they're not in control of anything that's going on. They're being trafficked. And so many people are caught up in this smuggling world that they're being sold a bill of goods that, hey, all you have to do is cross the border and we'll get you there. If you pay this fee, we'll get you there. And they're willing to do that. And let's say, look, the average cost was ranging from $5,000 to $15,000 a person back in Yuma. Okay. Well, I don't have that kind of scratch right there in my checking account. Right. And so what if somebody from a third world country says, okay, I'm putting all my money together and all I got is $3,000. The smuggler says, okay, I'll do it for $3,000, but you're going to make up that $2,000 difference. Well, they're going to do that, and they're going to make them pay off that debt somewhere along the journey. And then what they do is they oftentimes it's like a bait and switch. We got you for this price, but now we're going to traffic you. Now we're going to put you into prostitution to pay this. We're going to put you into indentured servitude, basically modern day slavery, into this to pay off that debt. That occurs. there are so many things that occur before they even arrive. This happens before they even arrive at the southern border. They're coached. They're told what to say, what to do. They separate families in groups. So a family of 4 gets mixed with another family of 4. So husband is with a new wife and new kids, crosses in Yuma. The other husband and new wife are crossing in El Centro, California. They get process released. They get met up in another part of the country, and then they end up having to pay off their debt. We are hearing in that, like, the sexual assaults and sexual exploitation along the journey has caused young women to get on birth control before they even make the journey to the United States, because they know that the likelihood that they will be sexually assaulted or even put into prostitution along the way is a reality to them. That happens before it even meets the border. Now, with the kids have no control of what happens to them once they're dropped off at the border, and literally dropped off in gaps or pushed through, telling them to walk through this area. And the safest these people has been when they've encountered Border Patrol. But to try to communicate with an 8-year-old, all right, it's very difficult, especially if they don't speak your language. Now, by law, and this is very, very important, by law, all unaccompanied minors, that means somebody 17 years old or younger without their parent or legal guardian, has to be placed into the Office of Refugee Resettlement. All right, they're responsible for the care of the children, these unaccompanied minors, and the placement with a sponsor or reunite them with family members. So what happens is they come across, they're unaccompanied, Border Patrol processes them, has them placed and transferred out, usually within 72 hours. They are placed in a shelter and in the responsibility of Health and Human Services and office, which is where the Office of Refugee Resettlement lies. And they're in some kind of shelter and all around the country until they're placed. Now, some of these things that we're finding out is that these sponsors are not vetted. We don't know who they are. They just claim that they know who little Johnny is and that they're a relative, and they come and pick them up. And there was a recent Inspector General report that showed, this was, I think, recent, it was late August or early September, that there's 325,000 unaccounted for children. In other words, there was 325,000 children that were in the custody of Office of Refugee Resettlement. They were placed with family or sponsors, and we don't know what happened to them. We called to verify everything's okay with little Johnny, and we never got an answer. So we don't know what's happening. So we don't know if Johnny is living his best life with his grandmother, or he's working in a factory paying off a debt for a family member, or he's being prostituted, or little Mary is part of a child sex ring, because this is what happens in this world. And America is the biggest, is the biggest, in the country, right? So this is the problem. So when we talk about
wait, America, I'm sorry to interrupt. America is the biggest in the country,
in the world, as far as the sex trafficking operations and things like that. Like, this is, what's the word? We're like connoisseur of that. That it's all here, right? It is right here in this country.
Holy shit!
We have got a problem, and there's a reason why 10 million people come over here, because in the last few years, because we are a great country, but we also have a sick part of this country that is part of this process, that is encouraging this behavior, and it's dangerous, and it's going on in every major city and every town in America. And that's why those movies like The Sound of Freedom and Grid Shock and other ones, these are not made up Hollywood sick B movies. These are real live stories. It's so crazy. And you get kind of jaded to it, unfortunately, because I've seen this kind of stuff play out over and over again. But I've never lost my passion to continue to combat it. It's why I do things today and talk about it on these type of platforms. Like even organ harvesting. I mean, who thinks about that? That sounds like some sick movie made it in an underground studio. No, this really happens.
The Chinese do it.
Yeah, it happens in Mexico. It happens a lot of places, like these stash houses that are being set up in parts of the smuggling route. Somebody's got money and says, "Hey, I need a kidney for a 14-year-old," and they're willing to pay. They're going to take a 14-year-old that meets the description, and they're going to take that organ, and that kid is not going to be taken care of. The kid's going to be left to die. One more anecdotal thing along with the kids, and this is coming from the horse's mouth. I was with a group down in Texas earlier this year. Actually, I think it was February, and we were doing a little border trip. And we did the border. We talked to local officials, and we talked to citizens. And we went to a migrant shelter. And the little kids are running around. A lot of the parents it's a family group, and they're waiting to take their bus ride to wherever they were going. And one of the guys I was with was interviewing, was asking questions to this one mom who was clutching her kid. Like, why isn't your kid just running around with everybody else? Well, she started this journey with her and her 3 kids. 2 of her kids were kidnapped and taken by the cartel because she didn't have enough extra money to pay. So they took her kids. She's never seen her kids since that. And she made it to the United States, gave herself up, got processed, and that's why she was still holding on to her kid. This is what's happening on the border. So when you've got the bleeding hearts out there, yeah, that makes your heart hurt. But we are creating this pull factor that puts people like that mother and her 3 kids in this false sense of this is how you do it. And then she has 2 of her kids kidnapped to pay off her debt. Now we have no idea what happened. Now, I want to think, they maybe bribed those kids to smuggle something across, and mom and her 2 other kids are reunited. But I also have a sense of reality and know that those kids probably did not enjoy life. And that's the sad part. Yeah. I only pray that mom got reunited and was with her children. But this is the reality that Americans need to understand, why it's so important that we take care of our border and clean up the immigration debacle that's taken decades to create. That's going to take time to fix. But we got if you really want to protect people and make this a humanitarian issue, we've got to secure the border so this type of stuff is not encouraged.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. I'm with you. I've always been this kind of way. The wall in particular has been very, very important to me since I started becoming involved in politics. I'm currently just kind of graduating from college, so I reach these exact people, that the bleeding hearts, the people that are really they have the wool over their eyes, basically, and it's real. It is real. Everything you hear on Fox News about these college campuses is real.
Wow.
I think this is a great segue into the policy area. Interviewing Chris Clem was one of the darkest and most harrowing interviews I have conducted so far. The horrors of the cartel, and especially human trafficking, are truly the depths of the human capacity for evil. The interview was also incredibly eye-opening, from the exponential increase of illegal border crossings under Joe Biden compared to the previous 2 presidential administrations, to the fact that people from all over the world are coming through the southern border, assisted by a web of technology that has changed the realities of border crossing forever. In part 2 of this interview, the situation on our southern border doesn't get any better. We cover the policies that allowed this nightmare to happen, the intentional destruction of our nation's security, and so much more. If you've made it this far in the episode, I want you to ask yourself, what is a nation without its borders? Would you really leave your door wide open to the public so that any stranger could walk into your home and live as they pleased? Without border security, the United States might as well be an empty plot of land that anybody can walk over, and I don't think that's what anybody wants for our nation. Thank you for listening to a More Perfect podcast. If you liked it, please leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. Please spread this podcast to your friends and family, and as always, have a more perfect day.